What if one student, quiet, invisible, underestimated, could stop an entire elite prep school with just a piano? Hey there, before we dive in, let me know where you're watching from the comments. I love seeing how far these stories travel. And if powerful, real, emotional stories like this one speak to you, don't forget to hit that like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell. Because every day, we bring you stories that deserve to be heard. Now, let's step into the world of Stonebrook Preparatory, where today, one boy's silence is about to become the loudest thing they've ever heard. The third-floor dormitory in the West Wing was as quiet as usual on Monday morning, the only sound being the crisp chimes of the old St. Elm's Bell Tower, ringing out like disciplined footsteps. Malik Carter carefully buttoned up his white dress shirt and tightened his gray and red striped tie, so perfectly that even he felt a bit unfamiliar with himself. Stonebrook Preparatory for boys was not a place for the weak. The school didn't have to say aloud. It was built into every ancient brick, engraved in every gold-plated motto lining the hallways. Discipline builds legacy. This school was created by men of privilege, and they expected their heirs to reflect that same legacy. Malik didn't belong here. He was the only black student on an art scholarship in the past 4 years. The son of a mechanic and a nurse from South Atlanta, not the kind of neighborhood where your classmates' parents own law firms or private clinics. But what made Malik truly different wasn't just where he came from. It was the fact that he existed in a space that didn't want to see him. Carter. A clipped voice called out from the end of the hallway just as he stepped out of his room. Preston Langford, son of a Board of Trustees member, known for fancying himself the model of Stonebrook standards. "Your tie's off by an inch," he said, eyes flickering between mockery and warning. Malik didn't respond. He quietly adjusted his tie and kept walking on his way to music history. His mind drifted to all the times he'd been overlooked, when he raised his hand and the teacher didn't see, when he aced an assignment and no one asked how he managed it. Here, he existed like an inconvenience, not bad enough to expel, but never good enough to belong. And today would be no exception. Class began as always with Mr. Graham Whitmore, a tall man with salt and pepper hair, a former classical pianist from New York who now taught at Stonebrook like a man guarding the gates of cultural heritage. "Classical music is a legacy of Western intellect," he began, "and only those of sufficient character are worthy to carry it forward." The class nodded. Malik stared down at his notebook, silent. Then, suddenly, Mr. Whitmore paused, his gaze sweeping the room. "Carter," he called out. The entire class turned to look at Malik. Preston smirked. Jaden, his roommate, glanced over with wary eyes. "Tell me, Chopin represents which kind of musical inspiration?" His tone wasn't loud, but cold and sharp, like a test of honor. Malik took a deep breath. He knew this wasn't just a question. At Stonebrook, mistakes weren't about losing points. They left cracks in your dignity. "Chopin was a leading figure of the Romantic movement," Malik answered, his voice calm and steady. A moment of silence. Mr. Whitmore gave a small nod. "Humph. First time I've heard you speak." Then he turned away. Class continued. But Malik knew. Something had just shifted. He remained seated, his notebook still open to an unfinished page of notes. But his mind was no longer there. He knew what had just happened. It wasn't coincidence. Mr. Whitmore had never once called on him. Not once. Even though Malik always completed his assignments. Even though he raised his hand in the dead silence of class discussions. The teacher's attention always landed on reliable faces. Names like Preston Langford, Henry Daughtry, Thomas Reed. Boys with surnames tied to banks, law firms, or the very foundations of this school. And today, after nearly a whole semester being invisible, his name was finally spoken. But Mr. Whitmore's gaze wasn't one of curiosity or encouragement. It was a gaze of a man placing a bet that Malik would fail. The class wasn't noisy. No laughter, but the air had thickened. Malik could feel the subtle shift in how they looked at him. Silent, but scrutinizing. No one said it out loud, but nearly everyone was thinking the same thing. Is today the day the scholarship kid slips up? Preston leaned lazily back in his chair, drumming his fingers on the edge of the oak desk. There was a cool thrill in his eyes, like someone watching a play whose ending he already knew. Malik kept his composure, but inside, his heart was beating faster than usual, not from fear, but from understanding. Every word he spoke today was either laying a brick in the image he'd fought to build, or smashing it down. After Mr. Whitmore moved on, the lesson continued with discussions about sonata form and the classical period. But the words no longer landed clearly. Malik's mind drifted back to other moments. Times he had raised his hand only to be ignored, essays graded harshly with no clear reason, the way certain teachers' eyes passed over him like he was only temporarily present at this school. After class, as he packed his books, a quiet voice came from beside him. "You answered that well." It was Jaden Marshall, his roommate, someone who rarely spoke, but always watched. Malik gave a slight nod. He didn't need praise, but he understood the value of a word of recognition from someone who didn't fake it. On the way back to the dorm, the midday sunlight slanted across the ancient stone hallway. Malik's footsteps echoed clearly. He had never felt so seen, and never so acutely aware of the weight behind every gaze in this school. At Stonebrook, honor didn't come from what people said about you. It came from the moments when they expected you to fail, and you didn't give them the satisfaction. He didn't smile, but something in him felt lighter. The next morning, Malik walked into class with a strange feeling. Not fear, not anxiety, just a sense of stepping into a play where he hadn't been given a script. On the chalkboard, Mr. Whitmore had written in neat script, "Jazz in the Western Canon, Debate or Disruption?" Malik paused. Jazz? In Whitmore's class. That was a subject a notoriously rigid teacher had once dismissed as a performance tool rather than true art. When the bell rang, Mr. Whitmore entered. He placed his briefcase on the desk, removed his glasses, and scanned the room. His gaze paused on Malik. It wasn't by accident. "Before we begin today's lecture," he said, his tone as even as ever, but with an edge that hinted at experimentation, "I received an interesting note from the academic office. One of our students, though you may not know this, comes from a family with musical roots." A soft murmur spread through the class. Malik felt the weight of every eye turning toward him, even though his name hadn't yet been said. "Carter," the teacher continued, with a half smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, "I hear your grandfather was a jazz musician?" Malik gave a small nod, saying nothing. "Jazz." Whitmore repeated the word as if pinching something sticky between his fingers. "Is a fascinating branch of popular music, full of feeling, raw, though perhaps lacking structure." A few quiet chuckles rippled through the room. Preston didn't bother to hide his grin, tilting his head toward Malik like he'd just been handed front-row tickets to a circus. "So," Mr. Whitmore went on, "I thought it might be instructive if tomorrow, before class, Carter could give us a short demonstration. Perhaps something your grandfather used to play? We'll see together whether emotion can substitute for a trained technique." No one laughed out loud, but the silence that followed was heavier than ridicule. Malik understood exactly what this was. It wasn't an invitation to perform. It was a public summoning, a trial by classroom, a stage to prove that street heritage could never stand beside academic tradition. He could have said no, said he wasn't ready, but that would have been the same as nodding to every gaze waiting for him to back down. Malik slowly stood. The room fell silent. He looked straight at Mr. Whitmore. In the older man's eyes was a glint of anticipation, tinged with quiet satisfaction. "All right," Malik said, his voice calm but firm. "I'll play." Mr. Whitmore smiled, a smile that looked like victory. "Very well. I trust the class is quite eager." Malik sat down. Preston whispered something to Henry, both snickering. Jaden leaned in and whispered, "You sure about this?" Malik didn't answer right away. He looked directly at the words written on the board, "Debate or Disruption," then nodded. "Yeah, I'm sure." That night, the hallway of the West Wing dorm exhaled a chill from its gray stone walls. The dim yellow lights overhead couldn't quite dispel the hollow stillness left over from that morning's class. Malik closed the door of room 211 behind him and quietly set down his backpack. The small room, barely over 100 square feet, was tight enough to make every sound echo. He sat in front of the upright piano against the wall, a dark wood instrument passed down by his grandfather, Isaiah Carter, sent from their old home in Atlanta just before he passed. Malik ran his hand lightly over the keys. Many were worn, the ivory chipped down to the wood beneath. But he didn't need a perfect piano. He needed a voice. And this was his grandfather's voice. His grandfather once told him, "The piano's not there to prove you're good. It's there to tell people you exist." Malik placed his fingers on the keys. A slow, classic blues melody unfolded. Not flashy, not overplayed. Just sound telling a story. A story of men who were forced into silence, and how they learned to sing with their hands. He practiced section by section, working through the chord transitions, his back damp with sweat. His eyes weren't those of a 14-year-old boy anymore, but of someone preparing to claim space in a world that never invited him in. But just beyond the dorm room door, where Malik couldn't see, a phone was quietly recording through the crack. Henry Daughtry, Preston's close friend, had followed through on a group dare. See what scholarship boy Carter's been hiding in his room every night. No one expected Malik to take it seriously. And if there was anything funny, a wrong note, a clumsy rhythm, that video was going to be played tomorrow, right before class. As a joke, a lesson in academic entertainment. Henry smirked when he heard the opening notes, but the longer he recorded, the more his brow furrowed. It wasn't because Malik was playing poorly. It was because he didn't understand why this music was making it hard to breathe. Inside the room, Malik paused. He closed his eyes, quietly counted the beat in his head, then shifted into a jazz improv section, completely created on the spot. It was inspired by summer afternoons in Atlanta, when his grandfather used to turn up the radio and whistle along with Billie Holiday. His hands moved across the keys like they were writing with wind. There was no audience, but each note rang out like it was tearing down a wall, one that Stonebrook had built around him since the very first day. When the music ended, Malik remained seated. He didn't need applause. He didn't need to be witnessed. He just needed to know that tomorrow he wouldn't be stepping up to perform. He'd be reminding everyone that some voices, once dismissed, couldn't be ignored when they finally spoke. Outside the door, Henry stared at the screen, his hand trembling slightly. The video was still recording, but he didn't press stop. All he knew was this wasn't a joke anymore. That morning, the wind blew harder than usual. The last maple leaves of the season scattered around the entrance to St. Elm's Hall, swirling with each step Malik Carter took across the gray brick courtyard. Though he knew today's class would open with his performance, Malik didn't bring sheet music. He didn't need it. What he carried instead were memories, legacy, and a silent promise to himself that today wouldn't be a performance, but a confrontation. As he stepped into the classroom, every eye turned toward him, but no one said hello. The room was silent in a way that felt icy. Only Preston Langford broke that silence, his voice cutting through from the middle row, loud enough for the whole class to hear. "Carter, did you bring a musician's hat? Or just a smile and some luck?" A few chuckles followed. Malik didn't respond. He simply walked straight toward the old upright piano in the corner, long untouched and forgotten. He gently lifted the lid, adjusted the bench, then turned to face the class and Mr. Graham Whitmore, who stood at the front like a judge who had taken his seat long before the trial began. "Before Carter begins," Mr. Whitmore said, his voice steady like a sermon, "I want to emphasize that today's lesson is a rare opportunity for you to observe not just technique, but character. Because music, dear students, is not merely sound. It is the definition of culture and of origin." No one laughed anymore. They didn't need to. His words had already drawn a line, a boundary invisible but sharp as a blade, between us and him. Malik sat down. He closed his eyes. In that moment, the room seemed to recede. The whisper stopped. The stares weighed heavy, like stones pressing on his shoulders. He remembered something his grandfather told him when he was 10. They may not want to listen, but if you play it right, they won't be able to ignore you. Malik placed his hands on the keys. No sheet music, no countdown, just the first note, deep, low, lingering, tearing the silence of classroom in two. Before and after, he didn't choose a famous jazz standard. Instead, it was a blues improv, a blend of classical structure and raw, free-form emotion, a rhythm only understood by those who grew up with the crackle of radio waves echoing through southern nights. Malik's fingers danced across the keys, telling a story without words. The sigh of a father repairing a car beneath the porch. The soft laughter bleeding through a late-night radio show. Every note held his childhood, quiet, simmering, but unshakably strong. The room froze. Preston stopped tapping his fingers. Henry, the one who had secretly filmed him, stared without blinking. Jaden sat up straight, his eyes brighter than ever. Mr. Whitmore said nothing, but his gaze shifted. Pride gave way to discomfort, and discomfort turned into something unreadable. Malik didn't look at anyone. He kept playing, soft then forceful, smooth then sharp, like every moment he'd ever faced a test he wasn't supposed to pass. When the final note faded, no one clapped. But no one could speak either. This silence wasn't the old kind, the cold quiet of prejudice. It was a stillness filled by something no one wanted to name, the realization that they had been wrong. Malik stood. No bow, no waiting for reaction. He simply turned and faced the class. And in that moment, though no one had said a word, Malik knew he had just reclaimed something they had never given him before, a place. The classroom remained in silence as Malik quietly stepped away from the piano. No mocking comments, no forced applause, just silence, different from the cold kind that used to fill the room. This time, it wasn't because they didn't care. It was because no one knew how to respond. Malik walked back to his seat. His eyes passed over Preston Langford, and for the first time, Preston looked away. The smirk that usually clung to his lips was gone. His head lowered to his notebook, pretending to check something, but his fingers drumming absently on the desk revealed he wasn't writing anything at all. In the back corner, Henry Daughtry, the one who had secretly recorded Malik the night before, didn't dare pull out his phone. The video he had planned to use as a joke was now undeniable proof of the opposite, and even he didn't know how to face that. To Malik's left, Jaden Marshall sat still, but he didn't need to speak. His eyes, steady, sincere, and full of respect, were all the affirmation Malik needed. Mr. Graham Whitmore remained at the front of the room, a piece of chalk in hand. But he didn't write a thing. He gave a small nod, not enough to be called praise, but no longer condescension he once wore like a uniform. "Thank you, Carter," he said, his voice lower than usual. That was an interesting performance. From someone else, the word might have sounded dismissive, but from a man who once declared jazz to be undisciplined street music, calling it interesting was a step, if not toward approval, then at least toward reality. He set the chalk down, straightened his jacket, and said, as if to close a moment, "Now let's return to the lesson." He turned back to the board. The class stirred, chairs creaking in awkward movement, but no one was really focused on the lecture anymore. Malik looked around. Everything seemed to return to its usual rhythm. But no, the silence now wasn't ignorance. It was awareness. A few glances, long absent, now flickered toward him, then quickly looked away. Something had crumbled, but something else had begun. When the bell rang, signaling the end of class, students stood. But instead of the usual rush to the door, most lingered a few seconds. No one wanted to be the first to leave after what had just happened. Preston rose, walking past Malik's desk. He hesitated for a beat, then muttered, so quietly only Malik could hear, "Not bad." Malik didn't look at him, didn't respond, but his eyes stayed fixed ahead, steady, like the way he had played each note on that dust-covered piano that morning. At Stonebrook, people don't change easily, but they remember. And from today on, Malik knew they would never see him the same way again. Just as the class began packing up to leave, Mr. Graham Whitmore turned back around, his hands still clasped behind him, as usual. "Before you go," he said, his gaze once again falling on Malik, "I want to remind you of something." The room settled. Everyone sensed it. Mr. Whitmore wasn't ready to let that performance pass without reframing it. Music, he began, his voice steady and formal, can move people in the moment, but emotion does not replace formal training. Anyone can memorize a piece of music, especially if they've heard it often enough. A faint ripple moved through the back of the room. Henry Daughtry glanced at Preston, but Preston didn't laugh this time. He only tightened the strap of his backpack. Malik remained by his desk. He hadn't planned to say anything. But when Mr. Whitmore's gaze locked onto his again, expectant, waiting, Malik knew he couldn't stay silent. He looked at his teacher, then asked, softly, clearly not angry but cold and precise, "If anyone can memorize a piece, then why were you hoping I'd fail?" That question struck like a stone across the surface of a pond they all thought was calm. The room froze. Jaden Marshall turned to look at Malik, eyes wide. Brandon Doss, the class clown who laughed at everything, stared silently at his desk. Preston turned away, his grip tightening even more on his bag. Mr. Whitmore paused, just for a second. But for students used to watching him control every moment, that second felt like a crack in marble. "An interesting question," he replied, voice lower than before. "We'll continue that discussion next week." Then he walked out of the room without looking back. That night, in the dorm room, Malik was wiping down the piano keys when Jaden pushed the door open. "Did you check the group chat?" Jaden asked, clearly worked up. "Not yet." "What's going on?" Jaden held out his phone. On the screen was a video of Malik's late-night practice, clearly recorded in secret. But instead of becoming the joke Henry had intended, it was spreading fast with a caption that said the exact opposite. No stage, no spotlight, still made the whole room silent. "This is Malik Carter, and he just did what no one dares to do at Stonebrook." The views were climbing. Comments poured in, many from students in other grades, even some who had never spoken to Malik before. Someone should let him perform at graduation. "First time I've seen Mr. Whitmore speechless. I don't even like jazz, but that gave me chills." Malik stayed silent, setting the phone down on the desk. "Did Henry post it?" he asked. "No." Jaden shook his head. Someone got the video off Henry's phone and flipped the whole story. And in that moment, Malik understood. There are some games you don't play to win. You play just so you don't bow your head. And somehow, that's what makes people change how they see you. Not everyone liked him. No one suddenly rushed to be his friend. But from today on, no one dared to look down on Malik Carter again. Since the performance, no one called Malik the scholarship kid anymore. Though no one said it out loud, he could feel the shift with every step through the cold stone hallways of the academic wing. The eyes that used to avoid him or look through him now followed him, not with admiration, but with something quieter, a mix of caution and respect. It wasn't a victory, but it wasn't a solitary battle anymore. In class, when Malik raised his hand, no one rolled their eyes or smirked. And perhaps most telling of all, Mr. Graham Whitmore. He never apologized. He never brought up the performance. But after that day, he began calling on Malik more often, and the tone was no longer skeptical, no longer as if Malik was wasting the class's time. 1 week later, during a lecture on Chopin and hierarchies in classical interpretation, he posed a broad question. Let's say a piece of music isn't written in an academic framework, but it moves the listener. Does that make it art? The class fell silent. Preston kept his head down, unusually quiet. The teacher looked around, then stopped on Malik. "Carter?" His voice was even, not high, not baiting. Malik thought for a moment, then answered, clearly, "If a piece of music can make someone stop, even for a few seconds, and feel something they've never felt before, then it doesn't need certification. It's already art." Mr. Whitmore didn't respond right away. But something different happened. He nodded, for the first time, not to end the conversation, but to acknowledge it. After class that day, Malik stayed behind to pack up his books. When the room was empty, except for the two of them, Mr. Whitmore quietly walked over to the piano, the same piano where Malik had once sat. "I once played Summertime in the Juilliard recital hall," Mr. Whitmore said suddenly, his eyes drifting toward the window. "Back then, I thought I understood everything there was to know about jazz." Malik turned, slightly surprised. "But the day you played, I heard something I'd never been able to touch. I'm not saying you're better than I am, but I think maybe I never truly listened with my whole heart. He paused, then placed a hand gently on the old piano. This piano deserves to be played with dignity. And you did that. It wasn't an apology, but Malik didn't need one. In the world of a man like Mr. Whitmore, those words were the highest form of acknowledgement. That night, Malik sat alone in his dorm room. He didn't open the piano. He just looked at it, like seeing a reflection of himself. He didn't need to win. He only needed to be seen, with eyes that no longer looked through walls. And what he had learned wasn't in any note or scale. Honor isn't something others grant you. It's what you hold on to, no matter who's watching. Spring arrived on the grounds of Stonebrook Preparatory for Boys, casting a gentler light, almost as if the weather, too, sensed something had changed. 3 months had passed since that performance. Malik Carter didn't become famous. He didn't become the center of any friend group. He was still a sophomore, still had lunch with Jaden at the back table, still walked across the stone courtyard with a backpack slung over one shoulder. But something had undeniably changed, not in Malik, but in how others looked at him. At the year-end graduation ceremony, always held with strict formality in Langford Hall, where each year only one student was chosen to perform the opening piece, a name rang out across the microphone that stirred the entire room. This year's opening performance will be given by Malik Carter, Class 10B. There was no thunderous applause, but there was a murmur, not of disapproval, but of surprise. Malik walked up wearing a simple white shirt, no bow tie, no velvet jacket. He gave a slight nod to the grand piano at center stage. The piano once reserved only for those deemed worthy. He didn't look at the audience. He didn't need to. The piece he chose wasn't lofty or complex, just a soft, honest blues, the kind his grandfather used to play on warm Atlanta afternoons. But every note spoke a journey, the journey of a boy once seen as an unwanted presence, now standing at the center of a space that never made room for him, and claiming it, not with noise, but with music. When the music ended, Malik didn't bow again. He stood, walked off the stage as if he had just done something ordinary. And that was his greatest victory. Not the applause, not the recognition, but the fact that he had existed, fully himself, within a system that once tried to reshape him. Mr. Graham Whitmore, seated among the faculty, clapped quietly just 3 times, then stopped. But the look he gave Malik, calm, following him with his eyes, was something new. It wasn't the look of a supervisor. It was the look of a man who once believed that talent had to be shaped a certain way, and had just seen it break through without asking permission. That evening, as Malik and Jaden sat outside the dorm on the stone steps covered in dew, Theo nudged him gently and said, "You know, I think what you did was make this whole school stop and really listen. For once." Malik smiled. "I don't need them to listen forever. I just needed them to stop ignoring me." And that was the final lesson. Some victories don't need a spotlight. They don't need fanfare. They only need a person strong enough not to bend, and brave enough to walk a path no one cleared for them. Malik didn't leave Stonebrook as a hero. He left as a student, but a student who had forced the entire system to see him through new eyes. And sometimes, that's the loudest victory of all.